In 1954, a 43-year-old Englishman named Lawrence D. Hills walked into the village of Bocking, near Braintree in Essex, with a mission that would eventually produce one of the most effective homemade fertilizers ever documented, and one that the modern garden industry has spent the last 50 years quietly pretending does not exist. The fertilizer is a liquid made from a single plant and plain water. It contains more potassium than composted animal manure. It has been measured in laboratory trials at a nitrogen-phosphorus-potassium ratio of roughly 3:1:5 on a dry weight basis, with potassium levels that exceed most commercial tomato feeds on the garden centre shelf. It costs $0 to make. It has been used in British gardens since the Victorian era, documented in agricultural literature since the 1800s, and validated by 50 years of independent research at what was then the Henry Doubleday Research Association. And walk into any Scott's Miracle-Gro retailer in America today and ask the clerk about it. They will stare at you. They will not know what you are talking about. They have never been told. That is not an accident. The plant is called comfrey. What it does when you combine it with water is genuinely remarkable. And the reason you have never heard of it has nothing to do with science and everything to do with who profits when you walk out of a garden centre carrying a $30 bag. The Victorian Englishman who figured it out. Start with the history, because the history is the part the garden industry cannot undo, no matter how much they ignore it. Henry Doubleday was an English Quaker born in 1810. He ran a printing business in Coggeshall, Essex, and spent his spare time obsessed with a plant imported from the Caucasus region of Russia, a hybrid of two wild comfreys called Symphytum X uplandicum, or Russian comfrey. Doubleday noticed what British farmers had been quietly observing for decades. The plant grew incredibly fast. It produced enormous quantities of leaf matter. When you composted those leaves or soaked them in water, the resulting material made vegetables grow bigger and flower more intensely than anything else available to a small gardener. Doubleday spent the last 40 years of his life promoting comfrey. He died in 1902, still convinced it was one of the most undervalued plants in British agriculture. 50 years later, Lawrence D. Hills picked up where Doubleday left off. Hills was a horticulturalist and one of the earliest advocates for organic farming in Britain, at a time when synthetic fertilizers were beginning to flood the market. In 1954, he founded the Henry Doubleday Research Association, an organization dedicated specifically to studying the plants and methods that the emerging agrochemical industry was writing out of mainstream agriculture. Its headquarters was on a small plot in Bocking, and on that plot, Hills did something no one in the modern garden industry has ever bothered to replicate. He tested comfrey properly. Over 2 decades of trials, Hills bred a sterile cultivar of Russian comfrey specifically for fertilizer use. He called it Bocking 14. It had 3 properties that made it uniquely valuable. First, sterile, would not self-seed and become invasive. Second, deep taproots, reaching several feet into the soil to pull up nutrients shallow-rooted vegetables could not access. Third, and most importantly, it concentrated potassium in its leaves at levels higher than any other common garden plant Hills tested. He published the results in his book Comfrey, Past, Present, and Future, which ran through multiple editions and is still cited today. The science has been on the record since 1976. What the numbers actually say. This is where the channel has to be honest, because there is a lot of hype around comfrey, and some of it is overstated. Permaculture literature calls comfrey a dynamic accumulator and claims it pulls extraordinary levels of trace minerals from deep soil. Master gardener and biochemist Robert Pavlis has looked at the actual laboratory data and concluded that the dynamic accumulator label is marketing, not science. Dry weight NPK analysis of comfrey leaves comes in at roughly 3% nitrogen, 1% phosphorus, and 5% potassium, That is good. It is better than most homemade fertilizer options, but it is not magic. Here is what is genuinely remarkable, and this is what Hills documented in controlled trials. The potassium content of comfrey leaves is 2 to 3 times higher than farmyard manure. On a usable nutrient basis, per pound of fresh material, comfrey delivers more potassium to your plants than composted cow manure, composted horse manure, or bagged organic fertilizer at any garden center. Potassium is the nutrient that drives flower formation, fruit development, disease resistance, and water regulation inside the plant. If you are growing tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, strawberries, or any flowering fruiting crop, potassium is the single nutrient that moves your yield needle the most, and comfrey delivers it better, cheaper, and more bioavailably than almost anything you can buy in a bag. One plant, properly cared for, will produce 4 to 5 cuttings of leaf material per growing season. On the Bocking Ecology Project research plots, a 13 square meter comfrey patch produced over 96 kilograms of leaf biomass in a single year across 4 cuts. That is over 200 pounds of fertilizer raw material from a garden bed smaller than a parking space. One mature plant can feed an entire small vegetable garden for the entire season and come back stronger the next year. The yields Hills documented in his 1960s trials, reported by gardeners across Britain, are still referenced in modern permaculture literature because no one has ever matched them with a commercial product of equivalent cost. And the cost is zero, because after you plant one comfrey crown, the plant comes back year after year for up to 20 years. How the method actually works. This is the part that sounds fake until you understand the chemistry. You take the freshly cut leaves and pack them into a container. That is the entire preparation. Hills discovered that if you crowd the leaves tightly enough, the weight compresses the lower layers. Cell walls rupture, and a thick dark brown liquid releases over the course of 2 to 3 weeks. No water, no stirring, no fermentation starter. The plant breaks itself down and releases a concentrated liquid that Hills called comfrey juice. When you dilute this, concentrate at 15 or 20 parts water to 1 part comfrey liquid, you get a usable fertilizer tea. Apply it as a soil drench around the base of tomato plants, peppers, and any flowering fruiting crop. The plants absorb the nutrients almost immediately, and the results, documented by British gardeners in the 1960s and reported to Hills's Research Association, are bigger tomatoes, stronger flower set, heavier fruit load, and darker leaves within 7 to 10 days. The alternative method is easier. Pack a 5-gallon bucket about 3/4 full of leaves, cover them with water, put a lid on tight because the smell is unbelievable, and let it sit for 3 to 5 weeks. Dilute 10 to 1 with water and apply the same way. Now follow the money. Scott's Miracle Grow does $3.5 billion in annual revenue selling synthetic potassium, phosphorus, and nitrogen in plastic bags. Their flagship tomato fertilizer costs roughly $30 for enough product to feed a small vegetable garden for 1 season. The active ingredients are mined potash from Canada and Russia, synthetic urea from natural gas, and phosphate rock from Morocco, shipped across 3 continents, processed with industrial chemistry, packaged and trucked to your suburban garden center. A single comfrey plant produces more usable potassium per year than you would get from 10 of those $30 bags. The plant costs about $5 as a root cutting, which you buy once and never buy again. Over a 20-year productive life, one plant delivers the equivalent of roughly $6,000 worth of commercial tomato fertilizer. And this is why you have never heard of it. There is no supply chain to build around comfrey, no patent to hold, no recurring purchase to capture. The Henry Doubleday Research Association never had a marketing budget. Lawrence Hills died in 1991 without ever earning a significant income from his decades of research. The organization he founded was eventually renamed Garden Organic and still exists in the UK, quietly publishing technical guides that almost no American gardener will ever read because no algorithm is paid to show them. 2 honest caveats. First, comfrey is mildly toxic if eaten internally because it contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids, which have been shown to cause liver damage in rats and in at least 2 documented human cases involving high-dose consumption. Do not drink comfrey tea. Do not make medicinal preparations from it without medical supervision. The liquid fertilizer you pour on your garden soil is perfectly safe for the plants and for the vegetables you eat, because the alkaloids do not transfer into the fruit. But the name comfrey tea is a gardening term, not a beverage. Second, the smell. When you ferment comfrey leaves in water for 3 weeks, the result smells like a sewer. There is no way around this. Keep the bucket outside, keep the lid on tight, and do not make it near your house. What you can do this season: buy 1 root cutting of Bocking 14 comfrey. It costs $5 to $10 from any organic nursery or through the mail. Plant it in a corner of your garden in spring, in partial sun, and water it well the first year. By the 2nd year, you will have a plant producing 4 cuttings per season. Start making comfrey tea in a bucket and applying it to your tomatoes, peppers, and flowering crops once a week during the growing season. Watch what happens. Lawrence Hills did this work in public, published the results, and asked nothing in return except that other gardeners try it for themselves. The Henry Doubleday Research Association tested it for decades. The Victorian cottagers who gardened with it for 50 years before Doubleday ever wrote about it knew what worked. The only thing between you and the most potent free fertilizer ever documented is a marketing budget that has no reason to mention it. If you want to see how the same pattern plays out with 2 other things sitting in your kitchen right now, how eggshells and wood ash beat every bag of Miracle Grow on the science, that video is on screen now.